In the year 1842, the British Empire forced the Chinese government to sign the Treaty of Nanking while holding guns to their heads. The terms of this agreement were deeply humiliating. China was required to pay huge war reparations in silver, open several of its ports to foreign trade, and give up control of Hong Kong for the next 150 years. This event marked the beginning of what the Chinese people call their century of humiliation. Foreign powers divided up the country like a cake, taking its wealth and forcing their will upon it using military strength and financial pressure. If we fast forward to the present day, the situation has changed in the most ironic way possible. China now owns more than $850 billion in United States Treasury bonds. They are one of America's biggest lenders. The country that was once made poor and shamed by Western nations is now effectively lending money to the most powerful country on earth. This is not just a story about money. It is a story of historical revenge, smart strategy, and a major change in global power that most people do not fully understand. The story of how China came to own so much American debt starts not in Beijing but in Washington, District of Columbia. It starts with a decision that seemed like a good idea at the time, but would eventually put America in a very difficult position. To understand this complete change in fortune, we need to go back to 1971, to a moment that changed the entire world financial system. Before 1971, the world operated under an agreement called the Bretton Woods system. This was a deal made at the end of the Second World War. The idea was simple. Every major currency would be linked to the United States dollar, and the United States dollar would be backed by gold. For every $35 in circulation, the United States government promised it had 1 ounce of gold stored in a vault. This gave the dollar value. It was not just paper, it was as good as gold. But there was a problem. During the 1960s, America was spending money it did not have. The Vietnam War was draining the Treasury, and social programs under President Johnson were very expensive. The government was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them up. Other countries noticed this and started asking to trade their dollars for the gold they were promised. France was especially aggressive about this. President Charles de Gaulle did not trust the dollar and did not like that America could print money to pay its bills, while other countries had to balance their budgets. So, France sent ships to New York to collect gold. Other countries did the same. America's gold reserves were disappearing, and the whole system was about to collapse. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and announced that the United States would no longer trade dollars for gold. He ended the gold standard. It was supposed to be temporary, but it became permanent. The dollar was now backed only by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It was what economists call a fiat currency. Its value came from people believing in it and using it to pay taxes. This decision gave America incredible power. It could print as much money as it wanted without worrying about gold reserves. But it also created a new problem. If the dollar was not backed by gold, how would America convince other countries to keep using it? How would it convince them to accept dollars in exchange for real goods like oil, electronics, and manufactured products? The answer came from Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich nations in the Middle East. In 1974, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. America would provide military protection and weapons. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only for United States dollars and invest its extra oil money in United States Treasury bonds. This created the petrodollar system. Suddenly, every country in the world needed dollars. If you wanted to buy oil, which every industrialized nation needed, you had to have United States dollars. This created a constant demand for the currency. The oil-producing countries took the dollars they earned and bought United States Treasury bonds. They were essentially lending their money back to America. This system was genius. America could import oil and goods, pay with printed dollars, and those dollars would come back to America as loans. It was like a machine that paid for itself. The United States was not just the largest economy. It was the center of the global financial system. However, this system had a hidden weakness. It required other countries to keep buying American debt. America was becoming dependent on foreign lenders. This was fine when the lenders were allies like Britain, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. But what if a rival nation found a way to use this system against America? This is where China enters the story. In the late 1970s, China was very poor. Decades of communist economic policies under Mao Zedong had left the country isolated and impoverished. The average Chinese person earned less than $200 a year. But in 1978, a new leader named Deng Xiaoping came to power with a different vision. He famously said that he did not care if a cat was black or white as long as it caught mice. He did not care about communist ideology. He cared about results and making China rich. Deng opened China to foreign investment and trade. He created special economic zones where businesses could operate with capitalist principles. He encouraged Chinese companies to make goods for export. Most importantly, he kept the Chinese yuan artificially cheap compared to the dollar. Here is how that worked. When Chinese companies sold goods to America, they were paid in dollars. However, Deng's government did not let those dollars trade freely in the market. Instead, the Chinese central bank bought those dollars and gave the Chinese companies yuan in return. This did two things. First, it kept the yuan weak, which made Chinese exports cheaper and more competitive. Second, it gave China a huge pile of United States dollars that needed to be invested somewhere. China invested that money in United States Treasury bonds. By the mid-1980s, China was becoming a significant holder of American debt. At first, no one was worried because China was still a developing country. American policymakers saw this as a good thing because Chinese money helped finance the American government at low interest rates. But China was playing a much longer game than anyone realized. Every year, the trade imbalance between the United States and China grew larger. American consumers loved cheap Chinese products. Stores like Walmart filled their shelves with goods made in China, from toys to electronics. American manufacturing jobs disappeared, but American consumers saved money and enjoyed a higher standard of living. The United States trade deficit with China exploded. In 1985, it was just $6 million. By 1990, it grew to $10 billion. By 2000, it was $83 billion. By 2010, it reached $273 billion. Every year, America bought much more from China than China bought from America. Those extra dollars flowed back to China, and China used them to buy more United States Treasury bonds. They were lending America the money to buy Chinese products. This system became a circular loop. Americans bought Chinese goods with money they often borrowed through credit cards. The American government ran massive budget deficits, spending more than it collected in taxes. To pay for this, the Treasury issued bonds, which China bought with the dollars they earned from selling goods to America. America then used that borrowed money to buy more Chinese products. It seemed like this cycle could go on forever. By 2008, China held over $600 billion in United States Treasury bonds. They had become America's banker. Most Americans did not understand the implications of this. They did not realize that every time they bought a cheap television or sneakers made in China, they were shifting global power. Then the financial crisis of 2008 hit, and everything nearly fell apart. The crisis started in the United States with the housing market collapse and the failure of major financial institutions. The global economy went into freefall, stock markets crashed, banks failed, and millions lost their jobs. The American government had to bail out major banks and corporations, which required borrowing even more money. The Treasury issued bonds at a record pace, and they needed someone to buy them. China stepped up. During the worst of the crisis, when faith in the American financial system was at its lowest, China kept buying United States Treasury bonds. Some saw this as a vote of confidence, but China had a different motive. They were trapped. By this point, China had over $1 trillion in United States currency reserves. If the American economy collapsed, those dollars would become worthless. China had to support the American economy to protect its own assets. It was like a creditor lending more money to a failing business, because if the business went bankrupt, the creditor would lose everything. China was pot committed, as poker players say. China also realized the strategic power of their position. If they suddenly sold all their American debt, they could cause a financial catastrophe in the United States. Interest rates would spike, the stock market would crash, and the dollar would plummet. China held a financial nuclear weapon. American politicians began to wake up to this reality. There were congressional hearings and reports about the danger of China owning American debt. In 2011, China's holdings peaked at over $1.3 trillion. This was more than the gross domestic product of most countries. Some Americans panicked, fearing China would use the debt as leverage. They worried China would threaten to sell the bonds unless America stopped supporting Taiwan or removed military bases from Asia. However, the situation was more complicated. China never had as much leverage as people feared. Yes, they could sell bonds, but doing so would hurt China just as much as it would hurt America. If China dumped the bonds, their value would crash, and China would lose massive amounts of money. Additionally, a weaker dollar would make Chinese exports more expensive, hurting Chinese factories and causing job losses. Economists call this mutually assured destruction. Both countries were locked in an economic embrace where neither could let go without hurting themselves. It was like two people holding each other over a cliff. Even though China could not use the debt as a direct weapon, the shift in power was real. For the first time in modern history, the United States was deeply in debt to a rival. America was no longer the undisputed financial hegemon. China knew this and began to reduce its vulnerability. After the financial crisis, China slowly reduced its holdings of United States Treasury bonds. They diversified by buying gold and investing in infrastructure projects around the world through the Belt and Road Initiative. They promoted the yuan as an alternative currency for international trade, making deals to trade in yuan instead of dollars. They pushed for the yuan to be included in the International Monetary Fund's basket of reserve currencies, which happened in 2016. The numbers show this trend clearly. In 2013, China held $1.3 trillion in bonds. By 2023, that number had dropped to around $850 billion. While they are still a major holder, the direction is clear. China is slowly trying to free itself from this entanglement to avoid the risk of American economic instability. Meanwhile, America's total national debt kept growing. In 2008, it was $10 trillion. By 2023, it exploded to over $33 trillion. The United States now borrows more than $1 trillion a year just to pay for current spending. Interest payments on the debt are consuming a larger share of the federal budget. America is now borrowing from anyone who will lend, including itself through the Federal Reserve. The real story is not about who holds the bonds, but how this situation happened and what it reveals about the two countries. It is a story about short-term thinking versus long-term planning. For decades, American policy has focused on the short term. Politicians focus on the next election, and consumers focus on buying now and paying later. The government cuts taxes and increases spending, borrowing to make up the difference. This is popular in the short term but builds long-term weaknesses. In contrast, China has played a patient game. They were willing to keep their people poor for longer to build industrial capacity. They accepted lower returns on investments to gain strategic position. They thought in decades, not years. While America focused on winning the Cold War, China was quietly building economic power. The irony is that America defeated the Soviet Union partly by outspending them, proving economic power matters more than military power. Then, America allowed another rival to become its creditor. Some economists argue this is not a problem because America borrows in its own currency and can always print more money. However, the worry is whether America is using this borrowed money wisely. Much of it went into consumption rather than productive investment. It financed tax cuts for the wealthy, wars in the Middle East, and consumer spending on imports. Meanwhile, American infrastructure crumbled, education stagnated, and inequality grew. China, on the other hand, used its wealth to build high-speed rail, modern cities, and a massive manufacturing base. They turned dollars into tangible assets. This relationship also has political and military implications. Historically, debtor nations are constrained in their foreign policy. It is hard to say if American debt to China constrains policy, but there are hints. America has been cautious about defending Taiwan, and trade policies have been inconsistent. Even the Trump administration, which was tough on China, had limits. Of course, America still has leverage with its powerful military, global alliances, and innovative companies. But the debt relationship adds a constraint. There is also a generational aspect. The people who made the decisions that created this debt are mostly gone, and the younger generation inherits the consequences. Some argue this is inevitable because China has 4 times the population of America. Others argue America made specific choices, like letting China into the World Trade Organization without demanding fair currency practices, or prioritizing Wall Street over manufacturing. These were choices, not inevitabilities. Now America faces new choices: reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing, fix the budget deficit, and invest in competitiveness, or continue on the current path. China faces its own challenges, including an aging population and massive internal debt. The relationship between these two countries will define the 21st century. They are locked in a strange financial embrace where America depends on China to buy debt and finance deficits, and China depends on America to buy products. Neither can afford to let the other fail, but neither trusts the other. This is not the outcome America envisioned in 1971 when the dollar seemed destined to rule forever. History shows that power shifts. The Chinese remember their century of humiliation and have now reversed 200 years of history without firing a shot, using economic strategy instead of war. Does this mean China won? Not necessarily. Economic power is not zero-sum, but the debt represents a shift that seemed impossible 50 years ago. The nature of power has changed. Military power is important, but economic power, the ability to produce, accumulate wealth, and lend, shapes the world. Britain was the workshop and banker in the 19th century. America took that role in the 20th, and now China is the workshop and a major creditor in the 21st. These shifts happen slowly, then become obvious. The question for America is whether this is a setback or permanent decline. Can America reinvent itself, fix its fiscal problems, and rebuild its manufacturing base? Or is it locked in a pattern of borrowing to maintain a lifestyle it cannot afford? The question for China is whether it can continue rising without provoking conflict or hitting its own internal limits. These questions will shape the coming decades. The current situation of mutual dependency is a strange piece based not on trust, but on mutual vulnerability. It is messy and complicated. In Beijing, officials look at their holdings of American debt and remember the Treaty of Nanking. They see this not just as money, but as dignity and a return to center stage. The answers to these questions will be written in balance sheets and trade flows, not on battlefields. The Chinese are patient, playing the long game. America has been impatient, focused on the short term. History shows that trends thought to be permanent can reverse suddenly. We are now in a position where China holds hundreds of billions in American debt, and America borrows trillions more every year. They circle each other warily, dependent on one another. This is not how the story of American dominance was supposed to end. Empires never plan their own decline. They always assume they are the exception to history. Rome and Britain thought that, and now America might be learning the same lesson. To understand the mechanics, look at a simple transaction. When an American buys a television made in China for $300, the Chinese factory gets paid in yuan, but the American retailer pays in dollars. The dollars go to a Chinese bank, which sells them to the Chinese central bank. The central bank then uses those dollars to buy United States Treasury bonds. The American government spends that money on military or social programs, and some of it flows back to American consumers to buy more Chinese goods. It is a circle. Americans get cheap goods, and the American government can run deficits. Chinese factories get orders, and the Chinese government accumulates reserves. But this creates dependency. If China stopped buying American debt, American interest rates would rise, or spending would have to be cut. If America stopped buying Chinese goods, Chinese workers would lose jobs. They are locked in a financial marriage where neither is happy, but neither can afford a divorce. This dynamic evolved over time. In the 1980s and 90s, this arrangement helped keep American interest rates low and financed consumption. It was called Bretton Woods II. But in the 2000s, economists warned the imbalances were unsustainable. The 2008 crisis exposed weaknesses in the American economy. Many thought China would stop buying bonds, but instead, they bought more to save the American economy and protect their own assets. After the crisis, China realized the danger of holding so much American debt, especially if the Federal Reserve printed money, causing inflation. China started diversifying into gold and other currencies. Meanwhile, American politics made it hard to address the fiscal debt. Attempts to cut spending or raise taxes were attacked, leading to paralysis. The Trump administration tried to challenge the relationship with tariffs, but the results were mixed. The trade deficit did not drop significantly, and consumers paid higher prices. The Biden administration continued tough policies but recognized the need to invest in competitiveness. The dilemma remains. To compete, America needs to invest, but investing adds to the debt. The average American has been insulated from these trends. Jobs have shifted to services, unemployment remains low, and interest rates stayed low for a long time. This disconnect makes it hard to address the problem politically. But history shows unsustainable situations can persist for a long time before collapsing. The question is not if the current trajectory will end, but how. It could end with America fixing its finances and remaining competitive, or it could end in a debt crisis where the dollar loses its status and global instability follows. There are many possibilities in between. Perhaps technology or an external shock changes the game. What is certain is that the current situation cannot last. The tragedy is that this was avoidable. America could have made different choices regarding manufacturing, fiscal discipline, and trade rules. Democracies struggle with long-term planning because politicians focus on the next election. China's authoritarian system allows for long-term planning but lacks flexibility and innovation. Both systems have strengths and weaknesses. The debt relationship reveals that America lives beyond its means, while China plays the long game. The nature of power has shifted. The country that can produce goods and accumulate capital holds the power. China learned from Britain and America. America forgot these lessons, assuming its dominance was permanent. Those assumptions are now being tested. The next chapter is being written now in decisions made in Washington and Beijing. The numbers are real, but the future is undecided. The story of the Chinese holding American debt is a story of the reversal of roles that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. From the Opium Wars to the modern financial system, the tables have turned. Whether China can maintain its rise or if America can reinvent itself remains to be seen. Empires rise and fall, and power is never permanent. The two nations are locked together, dependent on each other in a way that defines the modern era. The answers will not come from war, but from economics, specifically in how they manage this complex and dangerous financial relationship. The Chinese are patient, having waited decades for this moment. America is now facing the consequences of short-term thinking. The outcome of this struggle will shape the 21st century.